Estamos de regresso para mais um episódio da série da Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos, Isto não é assim tão simples, e hoje vamos tentar descomplicar, desmontar uma matéria que na verdade é bastante complexa, que é a economia global. Se já era bastante difícil de analisar antes da pandemia do Covid e também da guerra na Ucrânia, mais difícil se tornou desde então. Mas é isso que vamos tentar fazer com a ajuda do nosso convidado especial de hoje, Michael Spence. O Michael é um conceituado economista, vencedor do Prémio Nobel da Economia em 2001, é também professor nas universidades de Nova Iorque e Stanford e um autêntico craque no que diz respeito ao estudo sobre mercados laborais internacionais. Michael, it's an absolute pleasure, privilege to have you on the show, and it is quite a tough topic to tackle once we get into the global economy. But as an expert, you're going to try to let us achieve this. And let's start with a macro view of what we're dealing with at the moment, and make a brief comparison regarding the global economy, the powers at play, and the dynamics between those superpowers pre-COVID and post-COVID, because obviously it had such a big impact. That and the war that is going on in Ukraine now as well, of course.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. And, it's a very, very complex and uncertain environment. So I think the best we can do is sort of, kind of capture the trend. So at the most macro level, growth is slowing dramatically in the global economy and pretty much everywhere. I mean, China's going to have a very tough year. The global estimates of growth, by the World Bank and the IMF have dropped to just above 2%. We haven't seen that in years. Now, what's causing this? Well, we have very badly congested supply chains, and it's becoming increasingly evident that that's going to go on for a long time. We have inflation as a result of that, which is then starting to worry central banks. So we have rising interest rates, volatility, and a certain amount of fear in the financial markets. So that won't help. And then when the war came along, Europe basically has decided, I think correctly, but to undertake the difficult and expensive process of diversifying their energy sources away from the Russian, especially Russian gas. That'll take a little time, but it'll be more expensive as well. And so, you hear the recession word. I mean, I think whether you have a recession depends on where you are in the world. But for sure, it doesn't really matter if you're just talking about dramatic growth slowdown. So it's a pretty tough environment, frankly, with lots of difficult decisions. The central banks are basically trying to go down a narrow corridor and get at least reduce inflation without sort of producing a sudden stop in various economies. And that's, they will say, very, very difficult thing to accomplish.
We'll get into diversification in a moment. But first, I did want to focus on inflation, just because it's something that's affecting us all. I think we've all noticed a rise in prices, whether that's petrol or gas or electricity or just basic goods in supermarkets. How worried, and let's focus more on Western Europe, how worried should we be about inflation and how long it can last and what governments and banks can do about it?
Well, I think we should be worried. Because I think the proximate cause, so there's two parts to inflation, basically. One, inflation normally gets triggered when you have sort of some kind of problem on the supply side. Maybe it's slow productivity growth. In this case, it's a whole bunch of congestion, that the supply chain, global supply chains can't handle. Basically, the global supply chains were set up in a pretty unbumpy, unshock prone world. So they're wound tightly, they're highly decentralized, they're very complex. Nobody knows exactly what's going on. So they're myopic. There's no database, for example, that you can go to and figure out what's going on in the supply chains. So people misguessed the magnitude of these blockages. And I think, now we're starting to realize that, it's actually a world in which they're pretty important and much longer lasting than we thought. And I would add to that, we went through about 30 years of fairly powerful deflationary forces coming from the global economy as the relative price of manufactured goods went down. Massive amounts of previously unutilized productive capacity came into the global economy from emerging economies. And we've used up a lot of that capacity. And at the same time, we've produced tens and tens of millions of new middle-class consumers. And so we find ourselves in a world that we were really not used to, in which that deflationary force is fading. And the constraints on growth tend to be on the supply and productivity side, as opposed to on the demand side, which was the world we lived in pretty much continuously after the great financial crisis. So that's, so part one is, we've got extended periods in which we're going to have shortages and upward pressure on prices. And then, of course, wages and stuff will follow. But at some point, you build in inflationary expectations. So this is part two. Once they get built in, then if you take away, the supply and demand imbalances, you still have inflation, right? We experienced this in the 1970s. Some places still have this kind of dynamic, indexed wage contracts and stuff like that. And that's when the central banks have a very difficult problem, because to take those expectations out of the system takes a pretty aggressive set of monetary policies of the type that Volcker produced in the early 1980s. So the hope is we're not there with embedded inflationary expectations. And the hope is that, eventually we can get the global supply chains to produce, more or less what demand is asking them to produce. But if they can't, meaning if the supply chains can't meet that demand, and admittedly it surged after the pandemic, because in a lot of places, household spending power was stayed up because governments helped them, not experience too much balance sheet damage. So anyway, if we can't bring them back into balance by bringing the supply side up, then central banks are going to be forced to bring it into balance by using monetary policy to bring the demand side down.
It's interesting, Michael, because I think wherever you look, you find a shortage of supply. Whether it's friends of mine who have restaurants who are looking for staff, whether it's just the labor market overall has obviously changed a lot during COVID as well. So the supply and demand of labor, obviously those dynamics have changed, and we'll get into that later. But whether it's COVID affecting a lot of the businesses closing down and factories closing down or having to decrease their production, and then the war affecting obviously the energy supply and the wheat supply. I mean, everywhere you look, there seems to be friction. So how are we going to get out of this, and whose responsibility is to try to add some stability to this dynamic? Because we know Russia is a major problem there on the energy side, and obviously is creating a huge issue with the supply of many other goods out of Ukraine. But what can China and the US especially, as the two, I guess, major influential powers, do to give us some more stability so we can look at getting out of this?
Well, there's a kind of short and longer run agenda. So I think China's in a very difficult position right now. I mean, they have COVID blockages. They're blocking ports. They're blocking manufacturing. They're even blocking domestic consumption. So they're going to have a very unusually low growth rate this year, probably in low single digits, which hasn't happened for a long, long time in China. But they'll probably get out of it. So part of the answer is, at some point, China will put this COVID in the rearview mirror and start to function normally. And when they do, they'll be running at growth rates of 5 and 5.5%. And a fair amount, not all, but a fair amount of this will recede. I'll step by the labor market things because I think they're kind of probably more permanent. So we'll talk about that later.
Okay. Yeah.
But there's all kinds of things in a slightly longer run that you can do if you're serious about productivity growth, right? I mean, the digital technologies, for example, are very powerful instruments. You can have sort of policies that are designed to sustain the accelerated pace of adoption that we got in the pandemic economy, provide incentives for sort of going down that road and helping people make the adjustments in terms of skills and whatnot. So I think, I find it hard to give you a sort of a good answer that solves the problem in 2 to 3 years. But after that,
Yeah.
I think we got a lot of tools available to us.
Okay. Obviously, trade diversification is something which has been at the center of discussions, especially since the war started and Europe had to find other alternatives to Russia. What have we learned, and who can be a good model for let's say the EU countries or European countries to follow, as far as someone who or a government who is a benchmark for trade diversification and who does not depend too much on one energy supply or on one source for goods?
Well, I'm not sure there's an excellent model. On the energy side, I found that Japan, for a long time, had managed to diversify their energy sources. And Japan is a place that is essentially completely or almost completely dependent on foreign sources for fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. So in all three, coal, gas, and oil, they're really quite diversified. Now, that doesn't make nothing gives you perfect protection in this world, but they're a whole lot better shape than we are in Europe because of our dependence, especially on Russian gas. And we did that because it was cheap. So now we're going to sort of learn, what it's like to change that pattern and diversify away. And I think the European commitment to doing that is A, correct, and B, pretty serious. I mean, I wouldn't expect a reversion here. There are some bright spots in this. I mean, Europe, because of the war and because of having to meet this challenge together, has responded to both to the pandemic and to this challenge in a more unified fashion than they did with respect to the great financial crisis. And I think, it may, I'm not sure of this, but it may, tip the balance in Europe to a recognition that the European economy, which is huge, is really a powerful force in the world for the benefit of European citizens, but everybody else as well. And it's especially powerful if they're acting, together and not squabbling. So, I mean, the hope is we won't go back to squabbling and, focusing on our differences rather than the other. But the other important thing to say about diversification is it's not going to stop with energy and whatnot. I mean, I think one of the things that you observe is that this global economy, which has these tightly wound supply chains that don't respond well to shocks, is increasingly shock prone, from climate change, from pandemics, from geopolitical tensions, from all kinds of sources. And the rational response to that, I think, is going to be to diversify, and once that process gets started, it's going to make the architecture of global supply chains just completely different than what we're used to over many decades. I mean, our global supply chains were based on, going and finding and utilizing relatively cheap labor. They were based on efficiency and comparative advantage. They weren't very resilient, it turns out. Well, that's all sort of gone. I mean, and this diversification process is not going to be just a private sector phenomenon. I mean, you can clearly see emerging policies in multiple countries, Europe, collectively, the United States, China for sure, that are moving in the direction of diversifying their dependence on anybody in both the supply and the demand chains, meaning not just supply chains, but which markets, you are depending on to sell your goods, or at least the ones you export, goods and services. So I expect this pattern to be one of the most important, sort of changes that we're going to see in the next decade. And it will be driven by essentially, economic, national, energy, and food and other kinds of security considerations, which are just different from efficiency.
When one looks at the global economy and the forces at play here, obviously, we have to talk about the transition to digital, which you've already mentioned.
Right.
How is access to technology, in your view, affecting who grows and who doesn't?
I think it's a very, very important factor. Let's see. I mean, one of the things you observe is there's a correlation between growth and this global expansion of entrepreneurial activity that we're observing now. So, go back 15 years and you can count on the fingers of two hands or less, where most of the sort of technology, science and technology oriented innovation and growth companies and whatnot was going on. Just isn't true anymore. It's going on in the United States, multiple places in Europe, China, Latin America. There's 7 unicorns in Africa at the moment, depending on which day you look at the market valuations. The valuations, but it's, so digital is a pretty important part of the future story. I think it's an important part now. And at least in some sectors like tech, like finance and so on, digital is moving sort of very rapidly. And because of the pandemic, it's moving very rapidly in sectors that were lagging before, like education and health and a whole lot of others. When I listen to people who actually operate in global supply chains, they're basically going to do 2 things, and I think they're going to get it done eventually. One is to flip those supply chains so they start not with the raw materials and whatnot, they start with the customer, regardless of whether it's a business or a family or an individual, and then build the whole supply chain on a digital foundation back from that. And the digital technologies enable that. Now, that won't get done overnight, but I think it will happen. And you can't do it without the digital technologies. You just don't have, the tools, the information and control tools that are required to pull that off. So, yeah, I think digital is, even now, a pretty important correlate of, potential growth. And in the future, it'll be an even more important one.
As you mentioned during COVID, really, those who had access to technology had an instant advantage, and then certain industries certainly learned a lot on how to adapt and how to innovate during this period of time. How many of these trends do you think are here to stay? And when you look in the global labor market and you see an increase in the number of remote jobs that are available, how much of this is permanent in your opinion for the new generation of professionals who are entering the market now versus 5 years ago or 10 years ago? How much has changed in that dynamics of looking for a job, getting for a job, and being located in the headquarters of whatever company you're working for?
So I think it's getting, for the next generation, more important to become. This sort of happens automatically. That each generation is sort of automatically more comfortable with the emerging technologies. So if you take people like me and sort of ask, well, what do you think about the metaverse? We barely get it. Whereas the young people, they don't have any problem at all. They've been gaming for years. They're used to thinking about and taking advantage of, sort of alternative realities. And I've met people just recently who are going to use this kind of background and experience, and young people to do very rapid, design and that kind of thing. So I think in some ways it's sort of revolutionary. The digital technologies are producing in some dimensions just dramatically inclusive growth patterns. You can get to people with the right digital technologies and infrastructure that are basically remote, anonymous, hard to deal with in the conventional world. And a lot of companies, their profitability comes from, not all, but a lot of their profitability comes precisely from accessing clients, customers, and so on, who are otherwise out there, untouched by various aspects, services, and even goods. In the global, you see this in e-commerce, you see it in fintech for sure. They're touching people because of mobile payment systems and data that the traditional financial institutions, at least when they're not armed with the same kind of data, have very great difficulty dealing with. There's just lots of people with no accessible track record before this, no collateral, no nothing. They're just unknowns. And so, and then you see it in healthcare and education, as I mentioned before. It's pretty exciting. But what hasn't happened yet, and then I'll try to answer the question about, how much this is permanent.
Yeah.
The acceleration was real. I think the markets, a subset of the markets thought, well, we'll have a permanent acceleration. That's a bad idea. And they're resetting in part because of that, and in part because the interest rate environment is changing. And that resetting is pretty violent, as you well know. So there was, over enthusiasm about how much change was going to stick. On the other hand, the chances of, projecting that kind of acceleration into the future was, an unrealistic idea. On the other hand, we learned a lot in the course of being forced to use digital, when we didn't have an alternative. And a subset of those learnings, whether it's for individuals or institutions, are actually pretty valuable. And so the ones that we'll keep are the ones that are actually valuable. And let me take education just to make it concrete. Education was lagging in the use of technology. You can bring lots of resources into traditional educational processes in classrooms using this technology in principle, but we weren't doing it, or we weren't doing it very well. Then we had to do it, right? But the natural role in lots of contexts, including education, for this digital technology is as a complement, an add-on, an augmentation of what's there traditionally. So if you ask the question, well, as a result of all this digital technology and hybrid, or offline classrooms, online classrooms, are we going to, stay with that? The answer is no, right? I mean, there's just huge value, regardless of whether you're in kindergarten or in college, of having these interpersonal interactions. But are we going to use the technology to, probably dramatically enhance the quality, and the richness of the educational process? I think the answer is yes. If you go to healthcare, you get the same thing. Before the pandemic, if you asked doctors and their patients whether they were interested in using online consultations when it made sense, and the answer was essentially unanimously no on both sides of the market. Well, that's not the answer anymore, right? People have decided you can actually do this reasonably well. And if you have a sensible balance between sort of in-person interaction and the doctor actually looking at you and, taking tests and whatnot, and we're going to have a proliferation of at-home tests that are increasingly reliable as well. So everywhere you look, I think you're going to see change, not at the pace the markets thought might happen, but real change. And change that was faster than we would have experienced without the pandemic.
I did want to touch on Portugal just a little bit, Michael, because what I've noticed here, especially since the pandemic, is that this has become a more and more attractive destination for a lot of young people who are working remotely, who have an opportunity to have some kind of hybrid arrangement. Tapping into your experience and expertise, what can a country like Portugal stand to gain from this influx of expats coming here? And what advice could you give the government to make sure that this remains attractive and that also the locals are not priced out of this phenomenon?
Yeah, that's a complicated thing. So the hope is, and I'd be a little surprised if you had a sort of, a kind of thriving, tech ecosystem, which is what's happening around the world, right? I mean, you don't have kind of tech companies scattered all over the landscape anywhere, right? Right. If you look at France, they're, virtually all in Paris. If you look at Germany, they're virtually all in Berlin. I mean, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get the idea. Mm-hmm. So this notion that it's a kind of highly interpersonal thing is still there, and it's important. I would hope, let me put it this way. I'd be worried if that tech ecosystem that's developing in Portugal, I don't know whether it's in Lisbon or Porto or both mostly, or whatever.
Yeah.
What? Lisbon mostly?
Mostly.
Yeah. I'd be a little worried if it's all expats. That doesn't make any sense because there's talented, entrepreneurial, creative people in every country. And so I guess, if I saw that start to develop, I'd either advise or directly go into diagnostics as to the question why the local, creative young people aren't, sort of being part of this. Because that is not what we've seen in most places. It's a little bit the reverse. I mean, it's true that these ecosystems developed because some global players, or players that were really experienced went global. The Sequoias of the world, or the General Atlantics of the world, who know how to build, growth companies and whatnot. But they're populated mostly by local people, and they're mainly funding locals. And so you've kind of blindsided me with this. If that's a pattern, then it's one that I haven't seen before.
It's obviously that there's a Portuguese presence in the startup phenomenon, especially in the technology sector. But what has been clear to see, especially since COVID, is that with Portugal being such an attractive destination from a quality of life perspective, the number of expats, and especially young expats coming here to live, has increased exponentially. So that's what I've seen in Lisbon.
That's interesting. I mean, in some ways, probably what you may be seeing is something a little bit like what we see in the United States, right? I mean, when you go into Silicon Valley, you don't see a bunch of sort of, fourth generation Europeans only, right? You see Indians and Chinese and, a whole lot of other people. And they're attracted in part by just the attraction of the environment. That was one of the sort of selling points for Silicon Valley before it was a kind of powerhouse. But they're also attracted by the ecosystem itself, right? So if you put those two things together, then it may not be too worrying that you've got a combination of sort of locals and the other folks interacting in that environment, as long as the locals aren't being cut out, by that system.
Yeah. Yeah, if it's inclusive.
There's one other thing that happens. These people get rich fairly quickly, and they bid up the prices of everything. So there's another batch of locals, who find they can't afford to live anywhere near downtown Lisbon. And that's a different kind of problem. I mean, you can see that problem in Silicon Valley. There's people who don't participate directly in the tech sector in the sense of being the principals, but work there. And a lot of them are commuting from very long distances away because of affordability of the environment. And so that's a role in which government, has a significant role to play to kind of keep control of the local system so that there's room for everybody, whether it's housing costs or other things, because you don't want to populate downtown, Lisbon with all financial types or all tech types. I mean, that's not where you want to go.
Yeah. Look, I think there's a huge opportunity for Portugal to continue to expand in becoming more of an international, I think, hub for a lot of entrepreneurs. And it's something that obviously needs to have a balance as well in the local population. And I guess we'll see what happens in the coming years. I mean, if there are more comparisons between Lisbon and Silicon Valley, I guess that wouldn't be a bad thing. I wanted to close out this interview by asking you a few quick-fire questions. So in one word or one sentence, I would like you to try to answer these questions. So the first is, what is one personality trait a good leader could really benefit from having, in your view?
Humility.
That comes up quite a bit. Definitely key. What is the biggest challenge humanity faces today, in your view?
No, sustainability, I think. In my mind, without question.
If you could change one thing in the world today by magic, I guess, or superpower, what would that be?
I would get rid of the geopolitical tensions that I think are, in danger of inhibiting the functioning of the global economy at full potential for the benefit of everybody. I think it's if I could magically snap my fingers and get rid of something, I'd get rid of that.
And what is the most important learning of your life and career?
That's
I know it's a big one.
That's an interesting question. I think the most important thing I've learned is that what you have to contribute changes with your age, and you need to sort of accept that. So young people are at their most creative, very, very, in their early adulthood. We have to take advantage of that and support them. And as you get older, your ability to recognize patterns and your experience, comes into play and is, something valuable to contribute. But I think, outside of kind of family life, the most important thing I've learned is there's a natural evolution, and the way to think about it, or the way to react to it, is to kind of go with the flow, so to speak.
Okay. Well, I mean, we've certainly really appreciated having you share all the experience that you've been able to gather throughout your life and career here with us when talking about such an important topic such as the global economy, which obviously could serve to fill various programs, more than just one, certainly, and more than our conversation here, Michael. But thank you so much for having the availability to share your insight, and it was an absolute pleasure to discuss this with you.
It was for me too, and thank you for having me.
A pleasure. Prazer de ter aqui o Michael Spence, Prémio Nobel da Economia em 2001, a ajudar a explicar por que razão isto da economia global não é assim tão simples. Até breve.